Hello! You've probably seen this study around, Economic Development, Political Economic System, and the Physical Quality of Life by Saraceto and Waitskin. I won't go through this study again today as I've already done so twice, but the gist of it is this. The study empirically shows that under equal levels of development, socialist countries consistently scored higher on quality of life based on actual life indicators, access to healthcare, education, employment, minority rights, nutritional intake, etc. In response to this, it seems there have been a handful of quote-unquote responses. I hesitate to even call them that, as they're more like incoherent diatribes against concepts they fail to understand, but oh well. Seeing as this is the case, I thought I'd put their criticism in context, show how it's fallacious, and also discuss some more studies on the superiority of socialism if we have the time. I didn't even know people were talking about this till someone sent me a thread by a Reddit user named Hyasa Bruzzy, so thanks, Hyubi. With that said though, let's get started. Now, their arguments can be broken down into several. They either criticize the age of the paper, claim the data used is somehow not correctly interpreted, that this or that apparently socialist country is listed as a capitalist one, and a general lack of understanding of definitions amongst other things. Let's deal with them one by one. Argument number 1. The socialists skewed the data. Citation needed. Really. The study uses the World Bank's own data that has been corrected or readjusted by them specifically. The World Bank wasn't a tentacle of the socialist movement, that's for sure, so unless you're into that sort of conspiratorial thinking, the data is fine. By their own admission, and I quote, the World Bank's statistical reporting tends to be conservative, in the sense that overly enthusiastic statistics reported from specific countries are appraised and readjusted to obtain more accurate figures. More importantly, the data are readily available for inspection and reanalysis by other scholars. By the way, corrupt bureaucrats fiddling data to look better is an argument that goes both ways. In fact, unlike the nebulous claim it is for socialist countries, we know for a fact that capitalists regularly fiddle data, from finance to emission reports on newly produced vehicles, so unless you're willing to fall on the blade of that double-edged logic, the data is fine. If not fine, then good enough to draw a general conclusion at the very least. Argument number 2. It's an old paper. You're right, it is indeed an old paper, and sadly, many of the nations compared are now capitalist countries with vastly worse outcomes thanks directly to capitalist efforts at sabotaging and destabilizing them. My goal, and the goal of all Marxists, is to recreate this study by increasing the sample size of socialist countries. Maybe you can help us. If you truly care for empirical evidence, try not lobbying for the sanctioning and bombing of fletching socialist states, and we'll talk. Jokes aside, though, yeah, after 1991, the sample size falls to a level that makes it kinda pointless, because then you're comparing a handful of countries against over 100. Interestingly, even with that sample size, at similar levels of development, those few countries still do better than their capitalist counterparts. I wonder why. Argument number 3. Ex-socialist countries listed as capitalist. Yeah, no. Just because some party calls itself socialist doesn't make it socialist. There are real definitions that reflect realities on the ground, and no,
when the government does stuff,
isn't socialism for the love of God. If that were true, then that would mean literally every country on earth is socialist and that capitalism has never been tried. I swear being a libertarian just makes your brain rot or something. The classification within the study was based on whether a nation had a centrally planned economy or a market economy. In fact, this is the same classification you see in many CIA documents even. If the CIA can easily point out which countries are socialist and you can't, then you're either blind, stupid, or both. Let's list a few just for fun, though. Remember, this is all for the early 80s period. Syria, not a socialist country, never had a centrally planned economy, and in fact the Syrian Ba'ath Party was beginning to liberalize the economy during the era. Tanzania, nationalized a handful of businesses, but no central planning. Mali, no economic planning whatsoever, and a rapidly liberalized economy after transition of power within the same party. Iraq, just like Syria, a bunch of nationalized industry does not a socialist country make. Congo, Guinea, Senegal, I could go on. But what about Burma? What about the Burmese road to socialism? Yeah, again, a ruling socialist party doesn't make it socialist. You need to look at the concrete policies taken. Both Labour in the UK and the Swedish Social Democratic Party were socialist parties that had official statements of attempting to establish socialism in their respective countries. Unless you're willing to lump them under successes of socialism, as social democratic countries have usually better indicators on living standards than neoliberal ones, you can't consider Burma to all of a sudden be socialist. An argument can be made for Libya being socialist, but that's a conversation for another time. Regardless, the indicators for Libya actually skew the data more favorably for the capitalist side, so I don't think these people have seriously read the very short study. Again, you can only find an issue with this breakdown of market versus central planning if you yourself consider any minimal form of nationalization or government intervention to be socialism. And if that's the case, well, Allah yarhamak, as we say in Arabic. Saraceto and Waitskin's research has been recreated as well. Another study, The Political and Economic Determinants of Health Outcomes, a cross-national analysis by Lena and London, studied the conclusions of the aforementioned study, redid the analyses, and had this to say in their conclusion. To quote, "Our more fully specified models yield findings that are quite congruent with those of the earlier researchers. In other words, our results complement and strengthen the conclusions presented by Saraceto and Waitskin." With all that being said, though, these aren't the only two studies either. There are quite a few, actually. It's just really tedious going through academic papers, especially when they're well written. Long quotes with little substance added by me is somewhat boring, in my opinion. Regardless, we can break that rule just for the hell of it this time. Another great study is Has Socialism Failed? An analysis of health indicators under socialism. The abstract itself really sums it up. This article analyzes the widely held assumption in academia and the mainstream press that capitalism has proven superior to socialism in responding to human needs. The author surveys the health conditions of the world's populations, continent by continent, and shows that, contrary to dominant ideology, socialism and socialist forces have been, for the most part, better able to improve health conditions than have capitalism and capitalist forces. In the underdeveloped world, socialist forces and regimes have, more frequently than not, improved health and social indicators better than capitalist forces and regimes, and in the developed world, countries with strong socialist forces have been better able to improve health conditions than those countries lacking or with weak socialist forces. The socialist experience has, of course, also included negative developments that have negated important components of the socialist project. Still, the evidence presented in this article shows that the historical experience of socialism has not been one of failure. To the contrary, it has been, for the most part, more successful than capitalism in improving the health conditions of the world's populations. The study shows, well, the usual stuff. Broken down by continent, we start with Latin America. Cuba started with similar, if not worse, indicators than most Latin American countries, and under socialism and relentless embargo by the US, pretty much matched or outmatched all of them. And many indicators exceeded the US as well. Life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, lowest levels of malnutrition. So much for haha, communism, no food. Hell, even things like access to toilets. Age-adjusted death rate for enteritis and other diarrheal diseases, sanitation systems, access to medical care, Cuba consistently scores at the same level, if not higher, than unembargoed countries, much richer than itself. If capitalism brought these sort of results, we'd never hear the end of it. The real world, though, reflects the fact that capitalism is incapable of bringing out such tremendous positive change. Within Asia, China and India are compared. In fact, even that comparison isn't fair because China had an even worse starting point prior to the revolution than India had. China at the time of the study had a higher life expectancy than India, lower infant mortality, under 5 mortality, and child death rates, higher nutritional rates, higher levels of literacy, I can go on. The current improvements of China are even more dramatic now. And no, conservatives and liberals alike, you can't play the "oh, China is capitalist now" card if you blame every supposedly bad thing China does on communism. You either sit on one side or the other. Otherwise, you just admit your hypocrisy and then we can at least appreciate the honesty. Funnily enough, the only Indian state with favorable indicators is Kerala, the one place with a dominant, radical Marxist tradition in power. I wonder why that is. Must be a coincidence. A neat quote to add is this. Another major country in Asia with a great diversity of nationalities is the former Soviet Union. A comparison of the Asiatic republics of the USSR with comparable countries on their borders shows that health indicators are much better in what used to be the Socialist Republic of the USSR than in the bordering capitalist countries, even though these indicators were equally poor before socialism was established in the USSR. Table 19 shows the evolution of infant mortality rates in the Soviet republics, including the Asiatic republics. The estimated Central Asian infant mortality rate of 46 per thousand live births in 1975 was considerably better than that of Turkey, 153 per thousand, Afghanistan, 269 per thousand, and Iran, 120 per thousand. End quote. An important point, I feel, as most people always jump to comparing the USSR to the US, a country built on enslavement and genocide that had over a century of uninterrupted development ahead of the USSR, no sanctions, no international embargoes, no diplomatic vilification, practically nothing standing in its way to development, and it still fails massively to this day on even the most basic indicators such as access to healthcare, employment, equal representation, and so much more. A fairer comparison would be, for example, the countries directly surrounding the USSR, or those with similar historical, cultural, and economic histories. With that taken into account, it becomes abundantly clear which side of the border you'd rather be on. The author seems confused at a point, though, possibly due to his particular ideological leanings, when he states that European socialisms don't compare well with European capitalist nations. Later on, though, he goes on to show that this isn't the case, and that health and other indicators of European socialist countries are at least at the level of much wealthier, uneconomically blockaded European capitalist countries, if not only ever so slightly worse, which again has to have the surrounding conditions taken into account. Artificial limitations intentionally designed to limit all possible development of socialist countries tend to have the effect of, well, limiting the development of socialist countries. Not very well, but enough for the data to be evident. The only disappointing part of the article is his very myopic and, dare I say, even uneducated defense of social democracy. He has such ridiculous statements such as, it is important to stress that for most of the century, the two socialist traditions, meaning Leninist and Social Democratic, differed in their means but not in their ends. Indeed, social democracy for most of the century has aimed at the establishment of socialism. This is blatantly wrong. Leninist parties actually succeeded in eliminating capitalism within a few years in power, if even that. Social democratic parties, who held power for literal decades, never went past lukewarm subsidies and concessions. My point is pretty much a catchphrase at this rate. If socialism really sucks so bad, why do capitalist countries work so hard to make sure they fail? Why do they sanction, assassinate, diplomatically vilify, invade, bomb, sabotage, form entire globe-spanning military cooperation, and so much more if socialism would just supposedly crumble under its own weight? Maybe it's because they themselves understand the massive transformative ability of socialist economic systems, and are afraid that they'll lose all their power and privilege to it. They understand that very well, actually. It's just they're useful idiots that don't. Further research you can take a look at includes those appearing on the screen now. This isn't even all of it, but the record is fairly clear. Unlike the Mickey Mouse research funded by literal oil company barons and right-wing think tanks, market liberalization, privatization, and severe austerity on already poor populations doesn't make a country prosperous. It just makes those that fund that research prosperous. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Christopher Strombo, Maur Kadosh, David Rack, Decent Panko, Sandro, Paul Naylor, Thomas D., Oliver's Lion Custer, Dawn Lemon Party, Grillatine, Trail Carton 52, David LaFair, Rafat Ambusi, Gone Draves, Supreme Leader Sadeh, Apple Chomper, Cogspace, Madison Wheatley, Lero, Jared, and Robert Mitchell V. Thanks for watching.